669. 669. In the first and last verse, 669. This is my Father's world, and to my listening ears, all nature
Good evening, church. So glad and happy and encouraged by your presence this evening. I want you to know that I truly mean that. I'm strengthened by your very presence. And, I don't know, maybe it'll be one of these days that maybe everyone will return for the second hour of worship on the Lord's Day. I look out and see a lot of gaps in the pews, and that in itself is rather discouraging, if I'm being honest. But on the other hand, I am encouraged that you're here, that you made the decision to be here because you want to be here, because you put God first in your life. And I know there are many who are unable to come back, and I certainly understand that due to sickness and travel and things like that. But I know that there are so many who are clearly able to attend, and they just choose not to. And I don't think there's anything sadder than that. But I want you to know that I really am strengthened and encouraged by your presence, and I love you. So most of us here this evening, as I hope everyone's had a wonderful afternoon. I do want to start with that and say it's been a beautiful Lord's Day, and certainly Sheila and I wanted to say that we actually partook of the singing at the Leonard congregation this afternoon at 2 p.m., and that in itself was rather encouraging, and we were strengthened as, there wasn't a lot of people there in attendance, but you couldn't tell it by just listening. It was very powerful. The singing was uplifting, and it was energetic. It didn't drag. It was just really a wonderful singing they had, and one of the best singings I've been to in a long time, and I really enjoyed that. But I hope you've had a good afternoon, and as we come back together for just a few minutes on this Lord's Day, most of us here tonight already believe that Jesus Christ lived on this earth for roughly approximately 33 years, and believe that he died under the rule of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, that he was buried in a tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea, and that he came back from the dead on a Sunday morning. However, it is also possible, the case is that some here this evening may have a few doubts concerning whether all of this is true or not. In fact, all of us know, as we know, that there are many people right here in the Clay County area who have made up their minds that the resurrection of the Christ did not happen. Now, that's just a fact. So with these thoughts in mind, I would like for us to spend our time together tonight to consider this concern. That is, that even some Christians take everything that is written in the pages of the Bible by faith, but that others have a problem with much of what is taught in the Bible, and specifically, many people have a problem with the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So some of you might already know that when Thomas Jefferson had stepped down from the office of president, he started a project that he had wanted to do for a long time. Jefferson had always been impressed with the moral character and moral teaching of Jesus, and yet at the same time, Thomas Jefferson was he was always a little uneasy with the supernatural parts of the New Testament. So Thomas Jefferson decided to separate, as he deemed it, the real message of Jesus from the supernatural. And he published a new version of the Bible. And maybe some of you, like I said, are familiar with it. It's known as the Jeffersonian or the Jefferson Bible. So what I'd like to do on the next slide is to read the very last verse of Thomas Jefferson's version of the Bible. And notice I said this is Thomas Jefferson's version of the Bible. And he gives, in his version, he gives all the moral teachings of Jesus. And then we get to the very last verse of it. And this is what it is. According to Thomas Jefferson, by the way, that's a picture of what it looks like. Okay? According to Thomas Jefferson, this is how the New Testament should end. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. There they laid Jesus, and rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre, and departed. And that's it. That's it. That's the last line of the Jefferson Bible. Without the resurrection, friend, Jesus is reduced simply to a good man with a few interesting things to say. And that is the way that many people around us look at Jesus. They may be a little bit interested in what he said, that some even go so far as to say, yes, he was a good man and he had some great teachings, and yet they have a problem when it comes to his resurrection. They can't get around that. And yet, for those of us who are Christians or have been Christians for any amount of time, it would be difficult to overstate the importance of the resurrection. Now, certainly all of us are familiar with the Apostle Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul said that if there is no resurrection, that our preaching is in vain, our faith is in vain and worthless, and we are still in our sins. And those of us who passed away are gone forever, and we as Christians are of all people most to be pitied. This evening then, in light of what the Apostle Paul said, and to once again to assist our Bible Bowl participants, I would like for us to consider from Scriptures the very first example of those who had a problem with the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And I would invite you to turn with me to Matthew chapter 27. In our lesson this evening, I would invite you to look with me and together at Matthew 27, beginning at verse 57 and going through chapter 28, verse 15. And what we're going to do is consider the burial of Jesus. We'll consider the impossible assignment that was given to a select few or group of highly trained Roman soldiers. And as we study these things together, church, I want us to consider the most widespread and most repeated objection to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And as we study tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to structure our study around several very basic problems with a story that was put out there by the religious leaders of the day. But if you will, please look with me at Matthew 27, 57 through chapter 28, verse 15. And by way of background of our text we're about to read, we're right now picking up in the account late on Friday afternoon after the death of Jesus on the cross. This is Matthew 27, beginning at verse 57. Now when evening had come, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had also become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate commanded the body to be given to him. When Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock. And he rolled a large stone against the door of the tomb and departed. And Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary sitting opposite the tomb. On the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together to Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember while he was still alive how that deceiver said, After 3 days I will rise. Therefore command that the tomb be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to the people, He has risen from the dead. So the last deception will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, You have a guard. Go your way. Make it as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. Chapter 28. Now after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week began to dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone from the door and sat on it. His countenance was like lightning, and his clothing as white as snow. And the guard shook for fear of him and became like dead men. But the angel answered and said to the women, Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus, who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come see the place where the Lord lay. And go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And indeed he is going before you into Galilee. There you shall see him. Behold, I have told you. So they went quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to bring his disciples word. And as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, Rejoice! So they came and beheld him by the feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brethren to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. Now while they were going, behold, some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all the things that had happened. When they had assembled with the elders and had consulted together, they gave a large sum of money to the soldiers, saying, Tell them, his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and make you secure. So they took the money and did as they were instructed, and this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. Again, as we look back over this passage, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like for us to consider several basic problems with a story that was made up by these religious leaders. And certainly the first and one of the most basic problems that I'm sure that they did not anticipate comes in the fact that their conspiracy theory actually just confirms for all time that the tomb of Jesus was in fact empty. We can't get around that. And really, the idea that the disciples stole the body, that is just one of many theories out there concerning the resurrection. One theory says that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, that he just passed out from the amount of pain he was in, and then he woke up when they put him in the cold tomb, and he fought his way out. Many of our Islamic friends hold to that idea. Another theory says that Jewish leaders stole the body. Yet one theory says that the gardener, for some reason, moved the Lord's body from one tomb to another without telling anyone. And yet still another theory out there says that the disciples had hallucinations and that they only imagined that they saw Jesus alive after the crucifixion. And I know that there are some huge problems with all of these ideas. But ladies and gentlemen, one thing that all of these theories have in common is that the fact that the tomb was empty. I don't know if we realize just how important that is. I mean, in fact, it's pretty funny when we think about it. Because by coming up with a story that the disciples stole the body of the Lord, the Jewish leaders, which, by the way, were the enemies of Christianity, established for all time the fact that the Lord's tomb was empty. Think about that. And really, with nearly every weird theory out there, the one thing they all have in common is the empty tomb. There's no way around this. And what I find interesting is, in this passage from Matthew, is that the Jewish leaders, they don't argue with the soldiers. You know, the Jewish leaders don't say, oh, well, you guys must have been guarding the wrong tomb by mistake, so why don't you go back and dig up the entire cemetery until you figure this thing out? But they didn't say that. They didn't say, oh, you must have, the Lord just must have passed out and then fought his way out of the tomb. They didn't say that. They didn't say, you guys shirked your duty by allowing wild dogs to come and eat the body. They don't say, ha ha, very funny, you know, good one. Now show us where the body really is. The Jewish leaders don't go examine the evidence themselves. They don't walk a few blocks to personally inspect the grave clothes that have been neatly folded. They don't even go over there to examine the broken seal that had been placed over the tomb. But instead, they hear the truth from the soldiers, these first eyewitnesses. And the only way of dealing with the truth for them was to come up with this elaborate story about the disciples stealing the body. And even with this, if this is what really happened, if they really thought that the disciples had stolen the body, you would think, what would be the normal thing to do? Launch an investigation. But ladies and gentlemen, they didn't do that. They would have, if that had been the case, they would have hauled in the disciples. They would have made this public, publicized it. They would have put on some new, or would have put out some form of most wanted posters for Peter and John, and for the rest of the disciples for that matter. They would have called Pontius Pilate in on this. But they didn't do that. Because as it is, the leaders are the ones who arrange the cover-up. And by keeping this quiet, by keeping it hush-hush, the leaders established for all time the fact the tomb was empty. There's no arguing with this. That's an undisputed fact. And even today, when people spread the lie that the disciples stole the body, when our Islamic friends tell us that Jesus just passed out on the cross due to the amount of pain he was in, and he fought his way out of the tomb later, they also spread the very basic truth that the Lord's tomb was empty. Now think about that. I mean, friends, if the Lord's tomb had not been empty, why, the Jewish leaders had every opportunity right then and there. They could have very easily quelled and squashed the Christian faith right there. Done. They'd been done with it, but they didn't. They couldn't. If the appearances of Jesus, if they were just hallucinations as they claim, if that the disciples, they were just hallucinating, guess what? The body would still be in the tomb, but it wasn't. It isn't. If the Jews still had the body of Jesus, why didn't they just prove it? Why didn't they just produce the Lord's body and disprove the disciples' claims that he had arisen? It had been done with, right? Any explanation for the events surrounding Jesus' death must account for the fact that the tomb was empty and we've got a missing body. Now think about it. When the apostles started preaching the resurrection, you know, when Peter started preaching the first gospel sermon on the day of Pentecost just a few weeks later, the Jewish leaders, they could have very easily put an end to all of it right then and there by hauling out the Lord's dead body. They could have dragged that body through the streets of Jerusalem. They could have crushed the Christian faith right then and there. But they did not. They didn't. Because even the Lord's enemies could not argue with the fact that the tomb was empty. And you know what is especially hilarious to me? I find it quite amusing. Is that the Jewish leaders, by demanding, we just read it, by demanding this Roman guard, they were ultimately responsible for some of the most stunning testimony that there ever was that the tomb was empty. If the guards had not been posted, then perhaps maybe somebody could have made the argument. But as it was, the guards guaranteed that the body would not be stolen. And then on top of that, the fact that the guards were there that gave us the first third-party, unbiased eyewitnesses, professional soldiers, by the way, who had the job of making sure that the body of Jesus stayed right there in that tomb. These men were highly trained and motivated to make sure that that body stayed in the tomb. Okay? These men were highly motivated to make sure of that, and it doesn't get any better than that. I mean, you, as we say, you can't make this stuff up. It doesn't get any better than that. And thus, so with the very first attempt to try to explain away the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Jewish leaders proved once and for all that the tomb was empty. And that right there is the first problem with their story. By making this argument, they admit one of the most convincing proofs of the Lord's resurrection, that the tomb was empty. And that's first place tonight. But secondly, there's a second basic problem with the idea that the disciples stole the body. And that is, according to the story that was put out there by the Jewish leaders, the eyewitnesses were sleeping at the time they supposedly saw the theft happen. Can we think about that for just a little bit? Can we cook and simmer on that just a second? Let's just let that sink in. According to the conspiracy cooked up by the Jewish leaders, the best story that they could come up with, the eyewitnesses were sleeping when they supposedly saw the theft happen. Now, friend, what would you suppose? What would happen if I were to call the police and tell them that my neighbor robbed my house while I was sleeping? Well, I think the first question they would ask me, well, if you were sleeping, how did you know that it was your neighbor that stole your things? How do you know it was your neighbor? And guess what? That would be a valid question, wouldn't it? Well, sure it would. I have a feeling that those who admit to sleeping at the time of a crime are not usually considered the most credible and reliable witnesses. But in reality, it's highly unlikely that these guards would have been sleeping. Very unlikely. And even more unlikely that the guards could have been overpowered by the Lord's disciples. The fact that the Jews had to go to Pilate to ask for a guard indicates that they were asking for what kind of guard? A Roman guard. And like I said a minute ago, the most highly trained, highly professional guards there is. I mean, my understanding is that the Roman guard consisted of 16 men. Okay? 4 would be on duty while the remaining 12 slept. They would work in shifts of 4 to 6 hours. And we know from ancient secular history, what was the penalty for falling asleep while on watch? Oh, you know, it was death. It was death. History tells us that Roman soldiers who were convicted of falling asleep while on duty were stripped of their clothing and burned to death by a fire started by their own clothing. I don't know about any of you, but to me that would be some serious motivation for me to stay awake. I'm not going to fall asleep on watch. I mean, not only that, but we know from history that Roman soldiers were held responsible for the prisoners that were under their care. I mean, in other words, if they lost someone, guess what they gave in exchange? Their own lives. I mean, it was that serious. We remember, don't we, what happened when the angel helped Peter escape over in Acts chapter 12? The Bible tells us that when Peter escaped, when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. When Herod had searched for him and not found him, now watch this, it says he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away to execution. That's exactly what happened to Roman soldiers who fell asleep while on duty. That's pretty serious. And just to emphasize why a bribe was necessary and why this story was false to begin with, we should think for just a moment about the disciples who were accused of stealing the Lord's body. I mean, these are disciples, the strongest and most outgoing of whom was Peter, right? Peter, a man who less than 3 days earlier, prior to this, was so terrified of a little girl that he swore up and down that he didn't even know the Lord. Peter. And Peter was the strongest of these men? Well, give me a break. In fact, the Bible tells us in Mark 14:50 that all the disciples, they left the Lord and fled. So, ladies and gentlemen, is it reasonable to think that a small band of men who abandoned Jesus while he was alive would risk everything to go steal a dead body? Not on your life. Oh, no. In fact, it is ridiculous to think that a small band of discouraged disciples could have come to the tomb. Now let's get this straight. They could have come to the tomb. They could have broken the seal. They stole the body, peeled off 100 pounds of myrrh, which was basically tree sap. They would have neatly then folded the burial clothes, all while tiptoeing around 16 highly trained Roman soldiers who knew that they would die themselves if anything happened to the body. Now that right there leads us to the bribe. Here's the bribe. When faced with the truth, the Roman soldiers knew they couldn't go back to Pilate. The bottom line is that the seal was broken and the body was gone. Now, Pilate would not believe what had really happened. But regardless of the circumstances, their lives were over. They were finished. And so they took their case back to the Jewish rulers and told them the truth. And the Jewish leaders, we read here in verse 12, the Jewish leaders offered, according to verse 12, a large sum of money. And guess what? The guards took it. They took it, hoping that the Jews would be able to smooth things over and out with Pilate. And so the guards left the chief priests agreeing to tell the lie that they saw what was happening while they slept. Just a side note here. Do you normally need to bribe someone to tell the truth? No, not usually. You don't need to bribe someone to tell the truth, but as it was to these soldiers at least, the truth was too strange and it was too amazing and it was too out there. It was too dangerous. And so they agreed to lie for a price, to tell people that as they were asleep, they watched the disciples steal the body. Third very basic concept with the theory that the disciples stole the body, and that's this. The disciples, if they had stolen the Lord's body, they were setting themselves up for nothing more than torture and death, all for a lie. Now, does that make any sense? No. The evidence tells us that the gospel accounts were all written and circulated very soon after they were written, and that the gospel writers, along with the other apostles, were persecuted intensely for their faith in the resurrection. Now, good people, for just a moment, consider a motive. Would you consider a motive with me? What could have possibly motivated these men to lie about the resurrection? I would encourage all of you to either go to the library or go to the internet and check out a book known as Fox's Book of Martyrs. And I just looked over here earlier before we got started tonight, and I know it's over there. I've seen it there before, and I don't know if it's been checked out or it's just maybe out of place. I don't think they're in really any kind of order. But I'm pretty sure our congregation here has a copy of that. But if you can find it, Fox's Book of Martyrs. It's written by John Fox in approximately the mid-1500s. And it's the result of Mr. Fox's research into the history of persecution against those who claim to be Christians. And the book starts off with what he discovered concerning the disciples. According to Mr. Fox, at least, Stephen is the first martyr. He was stoned to death, as the Bible tells us in Acts chapter 7. The second martyr was James, beheaded under the rule of Herod Agrippa, and that's referred to in Acts chapter 15. He continues with Philip, who was scourged, thrown into prison, and then crucified in Phrygia in 54 AD. What about Matthew? Well, Matthew, as a result of preaching in Parthia and Ethiopia, was killed with a halberd. And basically a halberd was a long spear with an axe on the end of it, and that was happened in 60 AD. James, the Lord's brother, he died at the age of 94 when he was stoned to death by the Jews, and if I may be rather graphic, he had his brains beaten out with a club. Matthias, who was Judas's replacement, was stoned to death in Jerusalem and then had his head cut off. Andrew was crucified after preaching in Asia. Mark, what about him? He was dragged to pieces by the people of Alexandria, Egypt. Peter was crucified upside down. Paul, the apostle, was beheaded outside the city of Rome. Jude was crucified. Bartholomew was cruelly beaten and then crucified after translating Mark's gospel account into the language of India. Thomas was killed by a spear in India. Luke was hanged from an olive tree in Greece. Simon was crucified in what is known as today as Great Britain. Beyond the apostles, Mr. Fox in chapter 2 of that book goes on to describe the deaths of others who refused to give up their faith for the resurrection. Men and women who were boiled in oil, who were beaten with clubs, men and women who were thrown to wild animals, men and women who were sewn up in leather bags full of scorpions and snakes and then thrown out into the sea, men and women who were burned to death in the marketplace, crushed with weights, thrown off cliffs, buried alive, torn apart with iron hooks, burned with torches, closed up in caves to die of hunger. Men and women who had their skin peeled off of their body with red-hot tongs. Now, ladies and gentlemen, each of them was given a choice. And the choice was deny Jesus and live, or accept Him and die. And all of them, every single one of them chose to die. They chose death. They saw Jesus after the resurrection, ladies and gentlemen, and it changed their lives forever. It would change mine. I've not seen it with my own eyes, but this book is enough to cause me to die for it because I believe it. I accept it. The resurrection then was not a story that was invented and made up and then passed along by a very small conspiring group. But it is the true conviction of a huge number of people, men and women, who were willing to die for that belief. For just a moment, try to imagine what motive people could have possibly had to make up such a story and then suffer and die in such horrible ways. People lie for profit. People lie to build up their reputation. People lie to gain political power or some other advantage. People lie to save themselves. But I'm here to tell you, people do not die or lie in order to be tortured and killed for that lie. It just doesn't happen. What do they have to gain? Persecution? Torture? Death? And yet they stuck by their story even though it cost them everything. How many people do you know that would die for a lie? I don't think I can think of one. Now maybe there are a few, maybe there are exceptions who would, some people who would die for a lie, but I know from time to time we see some really weird stories in the news. But how many would suffer daily, perhaps for years, and then die a horrible death for something they knew to be a fraud? Someone might say, well, now, Chris, 19 terrorists died on 9/11. Well, that's right. But yes, they died for a lie. But do you think those men knew that they were dying for a lie? I think they were deceived. They thought that what they were doing, they were dying for the truth. They thought they were headed for paradise. But the disciples of Jesus, they were not deceived. They claimed that they had seen the Lord. They claimed that they had even spoken with Him. That they had eaten with Him. Now, good people, if they were not absolutely certain of that, they would not have allowed themselves to be tortured to death. Well, people just don't do that. The truth is, The truth of the matter is, the disciples had nothing to gain and everything to lose by stealing the body of Jesus from that tomb. What made the difference between a cowardly group of men hiding in fear on Friday night and the boldness that we see throughout the book of Acts? What made the difference? I'll tell you. The answer is found in John chapter 20, verses 19 and 20, where it reads, "Then, the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews," now watch this, "Jesus came and stood in the midst and said to them, 'Peace be with you.' When he had done this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad," it says, "when they saw the Lord." Did that go over our heads? They saw him with their own eyes. This is the only, that right there is the only explanation for why the disciples were willing to suffer and die for what they believed. This evening, as we summarize the evidence for the Lord's resurrection, it seems that we can react to the information in several ways. Several ways, you say, preacher? Several ways. Like the Jewish leaders, we can do everything possible to deny it ever happened. We can do that. Like the soldiers, we can wait and let someone else tell us how to handle it. You know, we can put the focus on keeping ourselves alive and employed. We can go with the flow and allow the religious professionals to tell us what to believe. We can do that. Or, like the women and other disciples, we can fall down and worship and then obey when we're told to go out and tell others about it. Hey, we weren't there. We didn't see what happened, but we believe it. Do you believe it? We believe it in the same way that we believe that World War II happened. We were not there. We didn't see it happen, but we believe that it happened. We were not there, but we've talked to those who were. We've seen the monuments. We've read the eyewitness accounts. In a similar way, we have the testimony of the Apostle Paul. And I mentioned earlier 1 Corinthians 15, and we have this, where Paul said, beginning at verse 3, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, then by the 12. After that he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep. After that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. Then last of all, he was seen by me also as one born out of due time. If you believe this testimony, we would invite you to do something about it, to obey the good news. The good news is the death, the burial, and resurrection of Jesus. We obey that good news by reenacting the Lord's death, burial, and resurrection in our own lives. That is, we die to sin. We allow ourselves to be buried with Christ in baptism, and then we are raised up through our faith in the working of the power of God. If you have any questions, we would love to study with you. But if you're ready to obey the gospel right now, you can let us know as we sing this next song. Let's stand and sing.